Hi, this is Malcolm North. I'm going to start off this team effort presentation, but I want to emphasize of all the names at the bottom of this picture here are the 6 co-authors all involved in this project. And we're going to do kind of a tag team worldwide wrestling type of thing where we'll tag each other and move through the different authors involved in this, with the exception of Scott, who could not make it today. So if we can go to the next slide. So there you see the roundup of the 5 of the 6 of us. And we can go to the next slide because you'll see this slide several times as we go through the handoff process. So I'm going to start with just an overview of this effort to try to define forest resilience and the approach that we took in this paper, which I hope has utility for many frequent fire forest systems and much of the California system that we're particularly going to be talking about in this paper. To start with, I guess I'd say that at least when I first started working in California back in '95, the emphasis often was on treating forests to try to restore the pre-European conditions when we had active fire regimes. But obviously that's changed very much, particularly with the advent of climate change. A much stronger emphasis these days on resilience, found in both the 2012 Forest Service Planning Rule, which was enacted, and now I believe most of the 155 national forests are in the process of developing new forest plans. Many of those plans have an emphasis on resilience, as does the California Task Force, the governor's panel, and its focus on where California forests need to go to be able to deal with this future stresses associated with climate change. But if you looked at this title and you go forest resilience and you roll your eyes, I am with you. This is not a topic that I originally wanted to deal with, but it hasn't gone away, and it's clear that it's hard baked now into the language we use, thinking about what we should be doing with forests. But I want to point out it has challenges in terms of applying itself to being able to measure or assess forests in how they're able to deal with stresses and the uncertainty of the future. And I think this Brandon Jack's quote from a paper effectively summarizes probably the 150 odd papers I read on resilience, which points out that resilience is a malleable term that may facilitate communication across disciplinary boundaries by creating shared vocabulary, and it's useful for bridging science and policy. But when you read that quote, you immediately understand, oh my God, it is a very difficult term to hardwire a level of precision into it that can be used in a scientific concept or that can be used as a way of measuring and evaluating forests. So to cut through much of this jargon, I'm going to say that simply what we did in this paper was to say, we're going to focus on frequent fire systems in the West and going to use working definitions, not absolute definitions, but suggesting that there are 2 principal concepts here that we need to at least define within the context of this paper and this approach. Resistance is a measure of persistence, focusing on minimizing change to a specific stress. And in particular, I think it's a good measure of what we're often doing when we're doing fuels reduction treatments. We are trying to harden the forest to fire, high intensity fire, and in particular trying to minimize the loss of the overstory trees, the backbone of the ecosystem, as they're sometimes referred to. Resilience, though, is a broader type of measure. It's a measure of adaptability, focusing on an ecosystem's essential structure and composition, and to a range of stresses, not simply one stress, such as fire, but to droughts, bark beetle, and anything else that may be coming down the pike at us from climate change. And that, I think, is going to be an important point here to make as we go forward with this. Next slide, please. So I think a more precise definition, at least less like nailing Jello to the wall, can be defined if we limit ourselves to a certain ecological context. And in particular, what we did was thinking about trying to define this term resilience in the concept of frequent fire forests. So a place to start in this is to think about what ecological concepts and theory has to say about the role of fire, because we really need to understand that to then be able to assess what resilience is in that context. And it's a very common theme that fire is similar to herbivory in systems where consumers control the ecosystem biomass and the species composition. So if we think about this as an analogy, in the upper right, you're looking at a savanna system or a grassland system. Obviously not in California unless the zebras have somehow got over here. But it's a system in which when you have very few predators, i.e. very few lions in the system, for example, then there's little plant competition because the herbivores really proliferate and end up limiting plant growth more than resource availability. So why is that important? Well, the reason why that's often used as an analogy for frequent fire is that you have a similar pattern play out in frequent fire systems where in the absence of suppression, i.e. you have very scarce firefighters or not a fire suppression policy, fire is going to proliferate and it's going to end up limiting tree density more than resources such as water, light, and nutrients. And because of that, it's significantly going to reduce the competitive environment. It's interesting that if you read some of the early surveys of California, a lot of them done by Lieberg in particular in Northern California, he has this great quote in which he's describing the forest that he's seeing back in 1902, saying that the suppression of the young growth has always been one of the serious results of fires. The land does not carry more than 35% of the quantity of timber it is capable of supporting. Obviously a focus on the timber resources, but keep in mind that 35% number because we'll come back to it later in this talk. Oh, next slide, please. So in particular, there's been a lot of work recently showing that vigorous growth in trees, and one measure of that might be ring width in particular that we can assess either by taking cookies out of trees or cores out of trees, that vigorous growth increases a tree's defenses to multiple stressors. So not only fire, but also drought, bark beetles. There's a pretty compelling amount of evidence that growth rates have a pretty direct correlation, at least in gymnosperms, conifers, that growth rates have a very good correspondence with a tree's vigor or ability to fight off these stresses. So in fire's absence, live tree density and biomass are going to accumulate. You have competition for growth resources now kicking in, and that's going to lead to a reduction in tree vigor. So historically frequent fire forests have been long-lived because they were adapted to stress pulses. And if you think about what forests used to experience in the past, these 400 or 500-year-old trees that are out in our landscape, they've been through many incidences of fire, bark beetle outbreaks, and other stresses. So you have to wonder, why are modern forests not so well adapted to these type of stresses? And we're going to suggest that one of the key differences here is that competition is a long-term press, fundamentally different than a pulse type of stress, which is apparent for a year or two. Competition is a continuous type of push on the system, reducing the vigor of the trees and compromising their ability to be able to deal with stresses. So that this fundamentally sets up the hypothesis that we work from in this paper, that for resilience, treatments to restore resilience in the system would need to restore tree vigor by creating very low densities characterized by little resource competition that sustain frequent fire for us historically. And with that, we can go to the next slide, and I will turn it over to Brandon.
All right, thanks, Malcolm. That is, I share your eye rolling at the resilience, and I think there was a question in the Q&A already saying, can we use a different word? Unfortunately, no, at least not in this presentation. So, by the way, so I'm Brandon Collins with UC Berkeley and also with Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station. Thanks, Stacy, by the way, for putting this all together. So I'll talk specifically about some data sets that we used, and then these will be revisited by a couple of our subsequent speakers. But for now, let me draw your attention to this data sheet that is scanned. We found these data sheets at the National Archives office in San Bruno, and what is in them was incredibly detailed, at least compared to the historical information we had prior to this, which a lot of it was based on tree ring reconstructions. So what we're looking at is a set of observations from a transect that was done to sample trees within a quarter section, and that is a 40-acre parcel that is part of the public land survey system. And the folks conducting this survey ran a transect right through the middle of a quarter section, and it extended one chain or 66 feet on either side of that center line. And in it, they recorded trees by 2-inch diameter classes, which is what you see all the way on the leftmost column, and then by species, which you see the 4 main columns sort of vertically. YP is yellow pine, sugar pine, white fir, incense cedar. And then they also recorded height classes. And they did this in what they called logs, the number of logs, and that is 16 foot. A log is a 16-foot section. So anyway, very detailed and highly quantitative, which was great from the standpoint of a reconstruction. So next, please, Ryan. So what we were able to do was we actually found, we started off with this area in the Stanislaus National Forest, for which a portion of the area that was covered by the Historical Timber Survey later became part of Yosemite National Park. So there was a really neat comparison we were able to do, was looking at the change in forest characteristics from this early survey, which was conducted in 1911, in the national forest versus the national park. So that was a cool comparison, but I'm not going to get into details there. And then we later found the same exact data sheets from a very similar type of survey conducted in the southern Sierra Nevada, which at that time was called the Kern National Forest. It's now part of the Sequoia National Forest in an area called the Greenhorn Mountains. So pretty detailed information, as I said, and lots of it. That was one of the neat things that was about this too, is that there was great depth. So we had almost 300 transects that were conducted. So essentially 300 pieces of paper like this that you're looking at from that Stanislaus Yosemite area, and then another almost 400 or so from that area on the Kern National Forest. And then, if you look at number of trees, I mean, it's a large number of trees, 20,000 trees, for example, and then less on the Kern because they didn't have as wide of a transect. They only had one chain wide as opposed to 2. But regardless, lots of area covered, lots of great detail. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we first did, and we just did this, well, we initially, I said, did it for these sites individually because we didn't have the data all at once. And as we accumulated more, we were able to do more things, and ultimately getting to this sort of synthesis, we call it, of the historical data. But this was one of our first attempts to try to characterize the variability in these forests, given these historical data collected in 1911. And we did a statistical approach called clustering. This was actually the algorithm is a k-means clustering algorithm. And what it did was separate out groups, essentially vegetation groups, based on the different characteristics we gave it. And we gave it species composition, tree density, what else? Tree sizes, and then understory vegetation information, particularly shrubs. It was the biggest thing we put in there. From this analysis, we got these 9 groups, and I'll show you the specific data in just a second. But just to look at this landscape, it's neat to see how that variability sort of plays out. Now, this is not really your fine scale variability, right? This is not looking at individual trees and clumps and things like that. This is actually, treating a 40-acre unit as a single observation. So it's a coarser scale estimate of variability, but nonetheless, it's still interesting to see how it plays out across this landscape. Again, it's about a 20,000, a little, maybe even a 30,000 acre area, depending on how you drew a circle around those points. Next, please. What you'll see here, this is actually some of those characteristics and how they actually play it out in these different vegetation groups. And one of the things that really stood out, first off, is just if you look at the farthest right column, the canopy cover column, just for those of you that know sort of some of our classic standards and guides for managing forests in the Sierra Nevada, we rarely take canopy cover conditions below 40%. Oftentimes it's really closer to something like 50% that we would do given some of our treatments. And none of these vegetation groups had anything close to that for canopy cover. Our highest was the group that we called the brown, essentially. We called it a mixed conifer, and it truly was a mix across the main species. And it had large trees. That was one of the characteristics that separated that particular group out. And its canopy cover was at 28%. That's pretty incredible, given that we're barely managing things below 40% and likely higher in many instances. Another column of interest perhaps might be the third from the right, and that is the basal area column. And you'll see some incredibly low numbers. Now, the first 2 groups, those would hardly be called forested. The first one was not forested at all. It was only chaparral. And so that's not surprising. It has very low basal area. The second group would be more considered, I think, a woodland in many cases. It was a lot of shrubs with a few trees, in the overstory. But as you start moving down to the different groups, you'll see that they're even in the more forested settings, right? The light green, which is a ponderosa pine setting, it's 60 square feet of basal area, which was the average for that. And then going up to a high of about 120 or 130 for some of our highest. Again, incredibly low numbers for basal area. And we generally don't manage our stands for those low basal areas in those ranges. So it's just something to consider thinking about this sort of overall resilience piece and how it ties in. We'll get into the specifics later. Next slide, please. We actually did a similar analysis for this area down in the Sequoia National Forest. Again, it was on what used to be called the Kern. This didn't, using the same approach, it only came out with about 4 of those different vegetation groups. But again, I'll call you to the farthest right column. That's the canopy cover column. And we really had some incredibly low canopy cover numbers. Again, nothing really close to that 40% number that we hold so sacred. The basal area numbers were a little bit higher in the highest group, that is that mixed conifer group in light blue. But again, generally much lower than we typically see in many of our stands. Next slide, please. One of the things that we were able to do particularly with the area in the Yosemite / Stanislaus, was we actually went back and remeasured some of the same transects, or what we believed were the same transects that were measured historically. They weren't monumented, but they were based on the public land survey system, and through GIS we were able to get our sampling again to the middle of the quarter section, if indeed that's where the historical crews were. And we just to collapse tons and tons of data down to 2 rows. I mean, we can very kind of crudely characterize forest change. And what we generally saw over that area was a doubling of basal area from historical conditions. And this is excluding areas that were that shrub and woodland groups. We really focused it on the forested areas here. And if you look at the tree density, and again, that's only trees greater than 6 inches, we had about a 5-fold increase in tree density. Again, much of that was shifted towards smaller diameter trees. The larger diameter trees were about even. And this was unique, by the way, because it included some of that area in Yosemite for which there was very little harvesting ever done. And so we still retained fairly large trees in the contemporary sample. That was not the case in other areas you'll see in a second. Next slide, please. So I went in detail on those 2 data sets. Those are the ones that are highlighted in the pink and in the orange. We also found 2 other data sets, different in character a bit because we did not find the data sheets themselves. We found the summaries of the data sheets, essentially where there was one line in a report that collapsed all of those individual observations down to number of trees, species composition, and then average tree diameter, maybe another row or 2 of information. But in general, coarser estimates, we couldn't get the tree level stuff like we did with the first 2 data sets. But still, we did know from the documentation that it was the same exact methodology, right? A transect run through the middle of a quarter section based on the public land survey system, blah, blah, blah. So a really neat opportunity to sort of combine these data sets across a really large gradient. I mean, we're not even talking about just a geographic gradient now, for which those first 2, the Kern and the Yosemite Stanislaus one, were kind of in that typical, mixed conifer belt. It's even bordering into, sort of on the edge of the mixed conifer, the lower edge of the mixed conifer. These other 2 data sets, one in particular, the one in green on the El Dorado, actually started to push to the upper end, the upper elevation end of the mixed conifer, even probably getting into what you might consider true fir forests. So putting these all together into one analysis really was a neat opportunity to look at these gradients and how they sort of, how they influence, let's say, historical forest conditions. Next slide, please. The last piece that I'll at least explain to you, and then we will go more into depth into this particular synthesis analysis. But I wanted to talk about large trees. There's obviously a lot of focus these days, management-wise, on large trees. And one of the things we did was a comparison. Now, this was not a true remeasurement at all. It was in the upper panels were the historical data, and it's broken into 3 diameter classes in inches, and it's just the number of trees per acre. On the lower panel is the same thing. Obviously, we don't have the species resolution, but it's not a true remeasurement. It's based on forest inventory and analysis data. So it's not a great comparison, but at the scale we're looking at, we think it's actually a decent approximation because of how broad that sampling for FIA, the forest inventory analysis, is. So what we're intending to show here is that throughout much of the area covered with our analyses, we generally see a lack of large trees across the landscape relative to the historical conditions. So despite all the changes, if you believe that doubling in basal area that I showed before, and lots of increases in tree density, those increases are almost entirely in the smaller tree diameter classes. If you're looking at the largest trees, the ones 30 inches and even those 40 inches and greater, we really are underrepresented in the current condition relative to the historical condition. And then that's, obviously due to some of our harvesting practices in the past. So I'll stop right there. I'll hand it off and I will look at the Q&A questions, and then I think we'll be back at the end for answering some of those. So thank you.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks, Brandon. I'll pick it up from here. And my name is Ryan Tompkins. I'm with the University of California Cooperative Extension in Plumas, Sierra, and Lassen counties. And I'll be talking a little bit about stand density index and relative stand density and what that means. And this is the next sort of lens that we looked at the data through. I'm first going to start with just a crash course in stand density index, which may be the bane of many forestry students. But actually there is a real beauty to the calculation in the index. And many of you might know stand density index from Reineke way back in the 1930s, some of the first set of foresters that were coming out from East. And essentially what Reineke did was he measured a ton of forested stands, and he looked at their average diameter and how many trees per acre were in those stands. And he came up with this relationship that created, you can see all of these dots, all of those are individual stands where they measured average diameter and number of trees. And he found that there was this sort of maximum density, a maximum density line above which forested stands just didn't grow past. And many of us know this colloquially in other biological sciences as a carrying capacity. And that's simply what this is. And this was later sort of codified by science, especially with Yoda in 1963, who really looked at the slope of that line and came up with the -3/2 self-thinning law, which has been, widely studied. While the slope of the line has been argued about in minutia, the relationship has really held true. And essentially, this is just a way to characterize the relationship between plant density and plant size. And so it makes sense when you think about this of like, look, you just can't have 500 40-inch trees per acre. It just doesn't exist out there, right? And so this relationship shows that as tree density reduces, tree size oftentimes increases. This has been, over the last century, it has been used in both even age stands. It's also been used in uneven age stands using the summation method, which is the equation that we used here. And more importantly, as time has gone on, ecologists have developed competition thresholds for this index. So when we talk about stand density, many of us relativize it. So if the maximum stand density is 100%, ecologists have used percentages of that 100% to describe ecological thresholds which characterize the competitive environment of those trees. So as you can see on the right panel, 25% of relative stand density is approximated to be about the onset of inter-tree competition, below which trees are free to grow without any competition. 35% is known as the lower limit of full site occupancy, where trees really start to compete with each other for resources, limited resources. In the Sierra Nevadas, that main resource is going to be water. 60% is known as the lower limit of the self-thinning zone. So between 35% and 60% is known as full site occupancy. Anything above 60% is where ecologists believe that competition is so intense between trees that it is starting to drive density-dependent mortality. And above that line is aptly known as the zone of imminent mortality. If I can give some gravity to that area. And so what we did here, which I hope you find is both exciting and cool, is we looked, we've known of this change in the last century. We know the story about fire suppression and densification and lignification of the West. But we decided to look at this issue through the lens of relative stand density. And here are the violin plots for the 3 forest types, the pine mixed conifer, the xeric mixed conifer, and the mesic mixed conifer. And in each one of those violin plots, you can see both the 1911 data spread and the 2011 data spread. And the width of those violin plots are used to characterize how many points are in that zone. And you can see that we've plotted those against these ecological thresholds for competition. And lo and behold, we found something really interesting. You can see that those violin plots between historic forests and contemporary forests are essentially inverted. And so when you look at that data numerically, the historic stands circled in green, 73 to 85% of those stands were below full occupancy. So those trees were growing in free competition or partial competition at best, but they simply were not, there was not a high or dense competitive environment ongoing in those stands. On the contrary, when we look at the contemporary stands, 82 to 95% of all the stands that were measured in 2011 using the F3 data indicated that those stands were all in either full competition or in the zone of imminent mortality. And so what we're seeing is a total reversal in terms of competitive environment in which these trees are developing and trying to compete for limited resources. So what does this mean? This is why we think low or relative stand density index might be a useful measure or metric when we're really trying to quantify forest resilience. Is because fires were limiting competition from the onset of regeneration. And I want you to think about this strategically, of these frequent low severity fires were really limiting competition when the trees were 16 inches tall, not 16 inches in diameter. Okay, so I really want you to think of both the structure and the process. These low stand densities minimize competition for resources. In the Sierra Nevada, that means water. While right now, it's very in vogue to say we're in a wildfire crisis, if you think about it, wildfire or high severity wildfire is just the symptom of the crisis we're in. The crisis that we're in is limited water availability that is impacting these forests. And so I think if we think holistically about these stands, we need to think about water deficits and the competition for water. As Malcolm really laid out well, these low competition stands really maximize individual tree growth and vigor over stand growth and vigor. And that confers a resistance to drought, insects, and disease, as well as confers trees that grow larger, faster, and also develop adaptations with greater resistance to fire, like thick bark, higher height to live crowns. And these low densities of large fire and drought resistant trees are really the backbone of these resilient dry mixed conifer ecosystems. And so I think we really need to start thinking about the habitat requirements for not only growing, but also maintaining large fire resistant trees and drought resistant trees. Where we think relative density can be useful is that it provides a very quantified metric for competition, and that's important in managing these stands. It provides these ecological thresholds upon which we can measure treatment efficacy and effectiveness, as well as longevity. All of this can be modeled using a forest growth and yield system model like FES. And it also helps us better characterize the habitat requirements for these large trees and large tree development, which we really think are the backbones of these ecosystems. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Rob.
All right, thanks, Ryan. I am an assistant professor of cooperative extension with UC Berkeley, and I'm a co-director of Berkeley Forests. Before I get into the management implications, I actually want to have an acknowledgement here. You know, these archive data that you know, that Brandon talked about, all these data sets, they've been absolutely wonderful from my perspective in terms of, you know, understanding how what forests look like under a fire maintained, you know, kind of environment. You know, I think it's also important to acknowledge that they're also a sad milestone in the removal of Native people, because, you know, what this was, it was a taking stock of the resource that was there following the forceful and tragic removal of people. So I wanted to acknowledge that. Next slide. And I have like a 10-second delay in my slide, so this might be a little tricky for me. But I think what the next slide is showing is a graph. Yeah, there it is. I think the no-brainer implication for me is that most of the change that we see between 2011 and 1911 is in these smaller size classes. So this is a little bit different than the graph that Brandon showed you. It's 1911 on the top, 2011 on the bottom. Note the difference in the scale in the y-axis there. And what I did is I put those little blue lines that are on top of the gray bars in the 2011 data. That's just the 1911 density within each size class. And so what I wanted to show you here is just a massive, massive difference in density, the higher density that we have in 2011 versus 1911 in these smaller size classes, 5 to 10 inch and 10 to 20 inch size classes. That's where the work is. That's the removal of those size classes. I think, you know, arguably is where most of the work is when we're talking about mature forests anyway, you know, forests that are currently, that we would classify as mature high density forests. At least for now, that's where the work is. And so that presents a management challenge, you know, for the context, for those management contexts that view 5 to 10 inch trees as unmerchantable and all the kind of challenges that go along with unmerchantable trees. You know, that's the challenge. It's like, even though they're unmerchantable, that's still where the need is in terms of density reductions. All right, next slide. Remember what the next slide, okay, there it is. And Ryan, go ahead and hit me with the next animation there. So I wanted to bring back this slide that Ryan introduced. And the first thing that I want you to think about is, you know, remember that 2012 to 2016 drought. It should still be fresh in our memories. You know, that killed 150 million trees, or resulted in a mortality, drought-related mortality of 150 million trees. And just imagine what impact that drought would have had if across the landscape, generally, competition was half of what it was during 2012. You know, that was a severe drought. There would have been drought-related mortality, but it wouldn't have been 150 million trees. Right? It would have been a fraction of that. So just imagine what we would, you know, the difference in terms of what our management response would have been to that drought-related mortality had we actually had these low competition environments that we're talking about. You know, I think that in terms of designing silvicultural systems or thinking about silviculture for resilience, this study's implications are thin earlier and thin heavier, right? So, you know, if you use this graph on the right and you have a stand of a given, you know, average tree size, or an average tree density, they'd be growing in size. And the kind of conventional wisdom in terms of managing for, you know, for growth and yield is to manage within these steps that are on the top there, those arrows on the top within the high stand growth zone. So this is the density management zone that I would argue is the conventional zone that we've typically gone for, right? So when a stand grows to the point where it's 60% of the maximum, then we bring it down to 35% of the maximum. And that's great from a timber yield perspective. But the fact is that Native Americans and fire, that it's clear that they weren't managing for maximizing timber yield. You know, that the density management zone was 35% was actually the maximum. 15 to 35%. That's significantly lower, right? And so, you know, when you think about how you might design a thinning regime within that kind of context, if that's your desired management zone, yeah, it involves thinning earlier and more aggressively, and then more time in between thins as well. Next slide. Trying to remember what the next slide says. Okay, actually, I wanted to take that one out for lack of time, so go ahead and go to the next slide. Sorry about that. Next slide. If it says management challenges, yeah, there it is. Okay, so you know, what we would like to do with the next phase of this project is to be more specific with the management challenges and the management implications for different, you know, landowner types. I'm thinking about private landowners and federal landowners as well. So these are really broad categories of management challenges at this point. We don't really, for lack of time, to go into all the various challenges that this presents, right? But one thing that I want to bring up is that, you know, managing for low competition environments, in some cases currently, but in all cases eventually, would require either cutting or burning large trees, right? Because like Ryan said, you definitely can't have 500 40-inch trees, but you also can't have 50 40-inch trees per acre. You can barely have, maybe not even 5 40-inch trees per acre if you want to have this low competition environment. Long-term timber yields would be lower than what we think of as the maximum. You know, if we were to kind of create these structures out on the landscape. We're talking about even more material removed. It's already a huge challenge even to do a low, what we think of as a low intensity thinning in terms of where to put the material, right? So we're talking about more utilization, more disposal hurdles. I do want to say here though that for anyone who's done this type of a, you know, this thinning to a low competition environment, there is more physical space, right? At the sand level, there's more physical space to deal with activity fuel, more piles. You know, I'm just thinking about the size of piles and the density of piles and the physical space between trees that you can have, you know, when you do something like this. And then also the increase in temporal space that you have for burning, right? So if you were using fire as a way to reduce the activity fuels, that low canopy density, it's pretty clear, you know, that will increase the window of opportunity, especially into the wet season, into the winter season, in terms of using fire. One thing that we got to think about is that shrub and regeneration growth it'll just be off the hook, right? That growing space that wouldn't be occupied by large trees is going to be occupied by a new cohort of trees and shrubs. And so how we manage that development of understory, whether it's with herbicide or fire or mechanical, I just think it's important to have that be part of the you know, the planning process. If we were to use this lower competition environment as a goal. And then there are some you know, a lot to actually have when it comes to retention standards on private and federal lands that we would have to deal with, because we actually can't in many cases we can't do this. We can't bring it down to these lower levels because a lot of the regulations were kind of built around the idea of maximizing sustained production of timber, and this is a different framework. Again, this is a different framework that we're talking about. It's more about managing for resilience instead of timber. Next slide. So I took a picture. What I did is I went out and I took a picture of a stand that's been prescribed to burn 3 times in the last 20 years. Because a lot of people might think that, well, if you've just used fire, you know, 3 times, then you're probably going to get close to the you know, the fire maintained density that existed before fire suppression. And so I wanted to show this stand because this stand has been burned 3 times in the past 20 years. This is not representative of a low competition stand. This is actually near or at or within the zone of imminent mortality that Ryan was talking about. It's still way too dense. You know, in terms of fire severity, I'm actually not worried about this stand at all. It actually has good resistance to a wildfire if that fire were to occur this summer. But given our definition of resilience, it doesn't have resilience because it's not you know, it's vulnerable to drought severity because of this high competition environment that it's in. Next slide. So this is my last slide here. It should be a picture of a much lower density stand than that last picture. That stand is actually right across the road from that previous picture that I just showed you. What I did, I tried to find a stand that was closer to kind of, you know, this quantified low competition environment that we're talking about. And it was this stand, again, right next to this other stand that had been burned 3 times before. This open structure, it's not just the space between the trees, it's also the heterogeneity, right? So we have this clearing in the background. It's about a 1 acre opening, and then we have over in the kind of in the background on the right-hand side, we have a higher density of younger trees. This structure was created with gap-based silviculture. In other words, group selection, and that plus a low basal area target. We very much had, you know, resistance to climate or to drought stress involved with trying to have a low basal area retention after this thinning harvest. And then it had a mastication and a prescribed fire. And so what I'm trying to say here is that, you know, it wasn't just one treatment that created what I would think of as a resilient stand. It was really a combination of things. It was a combination of treatments. So it's not just about pyrosilviculture. You know, if you think about pyrosilviculture as just involving fire or having fire, it's much more than that. It's a pyrosilvicultural system, right? It's thinking about how we can incorporate fire and how we can reduce density so that we can have these low competition environments. And it will take a system. And I want to close here and say that, you know, these classic tools that we have in forest management, stand density index, rotation age, frequency, these are all useful tools. Like, you know, these are the tools that we use to create this structure here in this picture. And I don't think we necessarily need new terms or new tools. It's really new targets that we have to have, but we can use our existing tools that have been around for a long time in forest management. So that's all I have. I will turn it over to Lex.
Thanks, Rob. Hi, I'm Alexis Bernal, and I am a research specialist at UC Berkeley Stevens Lab. So thanks, Rob. So we have a nice framework to describe forest resiliency. We have ways to quantify that resiliency, and we have possible pathways for promoting that resiliency. But what does that look like at these larger scales? And I think more importantly, if we do implement these sorts of treatment that, like Rob was talking about, to achieve these resilient characteristics, then how viable are these sorts of treatments under climate change? And that's kind of mostly what I'll be talking about. And that is explored in a paper that myself, Scott Stevens, Brandon Collins, and John Battles recently came out with, which builds off some of the work that we did with Malcolm's paper. And some of the goals of this study were to evaluate where restoration treatments are likely needed, where they will be effective, and whether this would align with current carbon policies. And we focused on carbon for that study because it's hard to talk about managing these forests for the future without talking about carbon. Forests account for about 95% of the carbon storage in California's natural and working lands. And the Sierra Nevada, Southern Cascade region in particular, accounts for about 46% of the above ground carbon across the state. I won't go too much into the details of that particular study, but I will talk through our key figures as it pertains to what resiliency looked like in the past and what it may look like in the future. And to generate these figures, we took those same 4 historical data sets that Brandon had mentioned earlier, and we show what those forest conditions look like at the landscape level historically, and project how those conditions may shift under climate change. Go ahead and put it to the next slide, Ryan. Thank you. And so this first figure looks at tree density. The figure on the left is a categorical regression tree, which shows thresholds and environmental conditions that are associated with certain forest characteristics. So in this case, it's tree density. And then this is a histogram of how tree density was distributed historically. And the figures on the right were generated from a random forest model. that uses those environmental conditions to predict what tree density looked like at large scales historically. So that's panel A. What they look like under climate change, and that's panel B, and the change in forest conditions between historical and future climate scenarios. And that's panel C, which is essentially just the difference between panel A and panel B. From the categorical regression tree, we see that maximum summer temperature and layer precipitation were the main drivers of tree density, with warmer sites supporting lower tree densities and cooler sites supporting higher tree densities. But even so, historical tree density was still limited to about 78 trees per hectare. And you can see in panel A that these low tree densities were pretty ubiquitous across the Sierra Nevada Southern Cascade region. The exception being at higher elevations towards the east, where temperatures were lower and precipitation was higher. But these cooler sites largely disappear by 2069, while 85% of the historical landscape had less than 75 trees per hectare. In panel B, we see that hotter conditions in the future means that about 99% of the landscape may not be able to support tree densities greater than 75 trees per hectare. In fact, panel C shows us that about 78% of this region is predicted to support lower tree densities than what existed historically. Next slide, Ryan. We see the same drivers for species composition. In this case, we used pine fraction as a proxy for species composition, which is essentially just the ratio between live basal area of pines relative to total live basal area. And we see that warmer sites, especially warmer sites that were flatter, historically have higher pine dominance, while cooler sites are dominated by other species like fir and incense cedar. In panel A, we see that about half the region historically was characterized by sites that were pine dominated, but that shifts with climate change. It gets hotter. Under climate change, with panel B indicating that 71% of the region is characterized by conditions that favor pine dominance. In fact, panel C shows that 62% of the future landscape may favor greater pine fraction than what was present historically. Go ahead to the next slide, Ryan. And again, we see the same drivers for above ground live biomass, with warmer sites supporting lower biomass and cooler sites supporting higher biomass. But even so, biomass was still limited to about 59 megagrams per hectare. And you can see in panel A that lower biomass, again, was pretty ubiquitous across the Sierra Nevada Southern Cascade region. Again, the exceptions being at higher elevations towards the east, where temperatures were cooler and precipitation was higher. But again, these cooler sites largely disappear by 2069. While 68% of the historical landscape had less than 40 megagrams per hectare, in panel B, we see that hotter conditions in the future means that about 85% of the landscape may not be able to support more than 40 megagrams per hectare. In fact, panel C shows us that about 76% of the region is predicted to support lower biomass than what it did historically. Go ahead to the next slide, Ryan. And so we see that resilient forests historically consisted of low tree density, high pine dominance, and low above ground biomass. These conditions were pretty ubiquitous given the range of the environmental conditions we evaluated. And this convergence of forest characteristics is likely explained by fire, which we know is a major driving force behind forest structure and composition. Because of the hotter conditions that we see in the future, resilient forests are likely to be composed of even lower tree density, higher pine dominance, and lower above ground live biomass than what existed historically. While our findings should not necessarily be considered these hard rules for forest management, what they do suggest is that the lower end of the natural range of variation is still a pretty good goal to have in terms of management. We also find that restoration is a viable pathway for promoting resilience under climate change. However, there are some caveats. There is still variability in the amount of precipitation that can occur in California, and this is largely due to the uncertainty in global climate models that we used to predict precipitation in California. So essentially, it could get wetter, it could get drier in some regions, and you can see, at least in this figure here on this slide, some areas of green. And that just shows that the models we use suggest that some areas may experience higher precipitation. And if precipitation increases, or stays constant, but temperature increases, then that means that we could have some areas that can support higher tree densities and higher biomass than what our overall results are suggesting. However, I would say that, that interpretation should be taken with a little bit of caution, just because there's still pretty high confidence that the frequency of periodic severe droughts will increase under climate change. So even if forests could support higher tree densities and higher biomass than what our results are suggesting, still working towards the historical range of variation can help to increase resiliency to these large-scale disturbances, like drought, like wildfire, and like insect outbreaks. But the highlight of the paper, and again, this paper is more so focused on carbon policy, shows that most of the landscape cannot support more than 40 megagrams per hectare, which is less than 25% of what currently exists in these forests. What this means is that we can't optimize carbon storage and forest resiliency. And where our study does provide insight on how we can really leverage these powerful and robust historical data sets to prioritize and conduct large-scale restoration, it also highlights the inherent conflicts between carbon policy and ecologically based forest management. And I think what it really shows is that these policies, whether they're forestry related or carbon related, should be readjusted to meet the challenges that these forests face under climate change. And then that's it for me.
Hey, thank you, Lex. Thank you all. We have some time here, and there's a number of questions in the chat. And the next, Stacy, keep me on task. About the next half an hour, our intention is to try to go through the questions and try to answer them to our best ability. I haven't been monitoring the questions as regularly as hopefully some of the others. Is there sort of a suite of questions that you guys want to start off with? And I'm posing that to you, Malcolm, Brandon, Rob, and Alexis. Or Stacy.
I've been monitoring a little bit, so I answered a few that were just kind of easy, I think, shortish answers. I saw a couple at least that were kind of trying to tie in habitat, habitat for maybe owl and fisher and how that jives with our data. So that could be a topic. And then, I don't know, a few about the data sets, whether or not they may be biased. I mean, I don't know how we want to go into that, but so I'm happy to start anywhere, Ryan, but those are the ones I saw.
Why don't you start with the data sets and that perspective, and then we'll move on to the habitat questions. Is that fair?
Sure. I'll try to be quick too. I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I saw there was a question from Wayne Spencer. I don't know if all of you guys can see the Q&A, but essentially here, I'll read it real quick. Is it possible to estimate to what degree the historic data may have been biased toward more harvestable landscapes? And he's citing steeper slopes, canyon bottoms, and what implications that might have in terms of interpreting results. I guess it's really hard to know, whether or not these data were biased. There was one specific analysis we did on the Stanislaus Yosemite area because of this kind of question that came up several years ago. And what it looked like, since at least that particular historical timber survey wasn't spatially comprehensive, there were lots of holes in it. It turns out that a lot of the area where they didn't have survey data, which we're calling the holes, they had patents on them. They had land patents on them. And I think they were either meadows in a small portion of cases, or they were maybe even patented by people potentially looking to harvest them and have in some way, basically the beginnings of the private timber companies in that area. And so what it looked like when we did some comparisons trying to characterize the topographic conditions of those patented lands versus the lands that we had data for, we actually were representing slightly steeper slopes in the area we had survey data for, meaning that the patented lands had flatter slopes. And I think there was a slight edge towards higher actual evapotranspiration values on the patented lands versus the lands that we had survey data for. So it would suggest that it may have been better for operability on the patented lands. So we may have been biased towards steeper slopes. So almost in the other way that was being suggested by the comment, which could mean that we were maybe not capturing even some of the higher end, values, maybe with larger trees or something like that on the flatter slopes. But other than that, there was another data set we had, the one from the most northernmost area, which was now occupied by much of what Collins Pine manages, that was pretty darn spatially comprehensive. The only areas we didn't have were contemporary meadows. So long story short, I don't think the data are very biased. I think they broadly represent the conditions out there, with that small caveat on the Yosemite Stanislaus area being slightly steeper slopes.
Great, thanks, Brandon. Okay, the next suite of questions that I'm seeing that come in are maybe that habitat piece. Malcolm, do you want to cover the habitat reconciliation with these lower density stands?
Sure, I can make a first cut at it, and then I know, Ryan, you and I have discussed, you've got some thoughts as well about this, but I'd certainly say that probably the most pushback or the most response I've gotten from people are, how do you accommodate or provide for species associated with denser forest conditions and higher canopy cover? And one of the things to keep in mind is that particularly if you look at that table that was next to the violin plots, it is true that the average SDI came out, I believe, 23 to 26%, but the range in the values went from 14 to almost 40%. And to my mind, it speaks to the fact that you have places on the landscape which had higher densities of trees, higher SDI values, probably associated with wetter conditions. And it's that variability that's out there on the landscape in terms of its productivity that I think can provide places for habitat for species such as the spotted owl, because they're moister and they can handle those kind of densities without crashing or without getting into a competitive situation. The other thing I would, the other thing I would point out is that we do also know that associated with these stands is a particular spatial pattern that's often been described as ICO, the individual trees, clumps of trees and openings, that would suggest that you would not want to leave these trees, perfectly widely spaced. You'd still want to maintain clumps and areas of high canopy cover, which to my mind can accommodate things like the nest sites for owls. Even though the overall stand or even the larger area may have a pretty low SDI, you have places, because of the nature of the spatial pattern that develops in these forests, that have clusters of trees with higher canopy cover. Ryan, I'll turn it over to you to add anything more to that.
And Malcolm, just real quick, Ryan, while you're thinking of your answer, I'll just say again that our unit of observation is really that 40-acre quarter section, right? And so we're missing any of that fine scale variability. So if we're thinking about potential habitat conditions, it's very possible that they existed on that historical landscape, just at much smaller scales, such that you didn't measure an entire 40-acre unit as uniformly high density. You probably had little pockets in there. So, I mean, just keep in mind the spatial scale of inference we have.
Yeah, no, thanks. There's some wildlife biologists on the call that I really appreciate are here, and I have a huge, I would love to hear from them, because I think one thing, Brandon touched on the heterogeneity piece, which we couldn't look at with the data set. Malcolm has also done a lot of work on this idea of the large trees and that high canopy cover of these very large trees. And that's something that we talked a lot about in this is, you know, at the end of the day, I think historically we've been managing for like 40% canopy cover, or these sort of very homogeneous canopy covers with less suitable size trees. And so what really struck me from this data is that there were pockets of high stand density, and you can see it even in the tails of these violin plots. Like, I don't know if you can see my cursor on the pine mixed conifer, or even on the xeric mixed conifer, it's pushing into that 35 to 60% zone. But what really struck me is that those are the exceptions, not the norm. And when we look at these forests on a landscape level, you know, when we stand at a ridgetop and look at this sea of forest cover, that really, these data suggest that those dense forests were not the norm, and that those refugia may have been in more favorable landscape topography, whether it's a drainage or a north slope. But it really, to me, signified that we need to start thinking about these forests in a much different light, that we very much normalized dense forests because of the way we are humans. And that I think we need to be managing for those pockets of refugia, like Malcolm and Brandon said, in terms of heterogeneity. But overall, that was not the norm in these open forests, these open historical forests. And I think that's what actually conferred the large diameter and size of these trees, because we all know that a large tree isn't necessarily an old tree. A large tree is a tree that's been able to grow. It's been given enough resources. And so when I think where I am on the Plumas, on the east side of the Plumas, on, let's say, the Beckworth Ranger District, for those of you who are familiar with it, there were 60-inch trees out there. I mean, huge diameter trees on very, very poor sites, you know, very sandy, decomposed granite sites. But the way they grew large was because frequent fire was limiting the competition when the trees were this big rather than this big. Sorry, I veered off the habitat piece, but I think one of the things when you read the paper, we do say is that, you know, we simply, given the federal and even state policies that are so focused on maintaining stocking, we wouldn't really be able to meet these restoration targets. Okay, shoot, there's some great questions in the chat. Which ones do we go to next? For someone who's been reading, does anybody that's been monitoring the questions see a suite that we could talk about?
I think there's just a
Ryan,
few very
I'd say
specific.
that there's a couple in there that just have to do with understanding what SDI is in terms of canopy density and basal area, like just going crosswalking between those metrics. Ryan, you probably have the most experience with that, so maybe just like a you know, a good resource to point people to for that you can recommend.
Okay, yeah, I do have a recommendation on that. For those of you, okay, this is the cool thing, is when you think about it, and I've struggled with this myself, is, you know, we're all managing second growth forests. You can't just do a thinning and obviously grow a 40-inch tree in 10 years. But so it's very hard when we have these historical stocking levels or basal areas or average stand diameters to just recreate that as a forester of second growth forests. But the power that I see for relative density is that it actually helps us create the environment or the growing conditions that will promote the development of those conditions over time. And so this can easily be done with a tool like FVS, where you could take your contemporary stand data, you can model what thinning down to 25% or 20% relative density looks like. And that will give you a basal area target that then you could give your crew to then say, mark to a similar basal area, obviously with tree size retention in mind. But there are tools where this makes it doable. I saw in the chat, there was another gentleman that asked, how do I measure STI? And I can't go into all of it now, but send me an email, because there is a way to take your plot data in the field using a simple fixed radius plot and calculate the STI while you're in the woods. So there is a way to do that if you want to be there and see it and breathe it while you're standing in the woods. Rob, I'm going to pass that on to you, or Malcolm or Brandon or Lex for anything that I missed.
I think Stacy was about to pick up on some, maybe on some of the, if there was another theme or something in the Q&A.
Sure. I think there's one that I don't quite know got touched on, which is when you're doing these treatments, how, and I'm of course scrolling through as I'm finding it, but basically how do you compensate so that you're not just releasing more CO2 into the ecosystem? And how, like, if you're looking at growth lifespan trade-offs due to elevated CO2 levels, how do you contextualize that information? So, you know, what do we do with the CO2 as we're doing these treatments, and how do we think about that? And by CO2, I mean extra carbon, because of course it's not always CO2.
Go for it, Lex. I saw you shifting.
Yeah, I was rereading the question again. So how do we successfully remove all the many understory small attempts without contributing more CO2 release for aspiring carbon sources? Yeah, so the answer to this question kind of depends on how you're actually accounting for that carbon that you remove from your forest. Because right now, if you are a land, from my understanding, if you are a land manager and you are involved in a carbon project, meaning that you get some sort of carbon credits for the way that you're managing your forest, you actually get a carbon credit for the trees that you remove from your initial stand down to some predetermined level, and that's usually the stocking guides for that stand. So you're given a carbon credit for that. So it's not really a loss if you can show that that carbon is stored long term in, like, let's say, like a timber product that's used in a house. And then you're accredited carbon over the next 100 years based on the residual growth or the growth that occurs in the trees that are left in your stand. So it's not necessarily like you're losing any carbon. I think where you have some sort of issues in terms of accounting for the carbon losses when you do these sorts of treatments is that you're not necessarily compensated as a land manager for the amount of emissions that are offset by the potential of, like, losing those trees during a large scale disturbance like wildfire or insect outbreak or drought. There just isn't a policy set in place to even address that right now. And there are advocacy groups that are working on that right now. I believe Climate Forward is one of them, about working with CARB to adjust that policy as it exists now. But right now, from my understanding, is you don't necessarily are losing that carbon if you're actually putting it in a timber product. Now, a lot of the trees that we're talking about, like Rob mentioned, are these non-merchantable trees, right? And so the only option that we usually have for handling those sorts of trees is by either pile burning them, masticating them, or sending them to a cogen facility. Which, again, there's already, like, a lot of issues that arise with, like, the biomass utilization market. I don't know if that really answers that question, but that was my first crack at it. I don't know if anybody else has any additional things to say to that.
Actually, Lex, I have there's a question in here that I think is a really good one, and I think your paper really does a good job at looking at the future of these forests. But somebody brought up, Taylor's paper where he suggests that the reference condition is 1775, not 1911. I'm going to ask you all to weigh in on, okay, so we looked at like historic range of variation, but in a nutshell, do you think that's enough for future range of variation?
Yeah, I think if you kind of look at our paper a little bit, it would suggest that in many of these areas, you're going to be going outside of the historical range of variation, and that, or the natural range of variation. So that's not to say that these sorts of restoration treatments or these guidelines based on the historical range of variation is not viable. It is, but you're probably going to want to go below and maybe even outside of that. But that's, again, easier said than done, because as like Rob mentioned, that's just really not legal what we're suggesting, right? So it's not just about, it's nice to say, oh, this is what resilient characteristics look like. I mean, it's nice to know what they look like, but can we actually implement them right now, given like the limitations and the barriers that we have? And can we do it at the scale that's necessary to meet the challenges with climate change? And my guess is that we're not there yet, and we may not be there soon. But yeah, I would say that we would probably, even in some cases, want to go outside the historical range of variation, where you are going to have these novel environments that just didn't exist historically.
Yeah, and I'll add that that's a fair point. The 1911, that's just 1 year, right? And so that's serving as our, I don't think we're saying that that's the ultimate reference that we should be using, and it does make sense that it should be earlier in that, whatever that was in the 17th century. But I think what Lex's paper I think did a really nice job of was this idea of really kind of not just using historical conditions, but then using the future climate and seeing what the future climate might be able to support. And it's this kind of, I think this is, it's almost like I guess an art form of with a lot of technological kind of work behind it, but this merging of what a fire maintained forest used to look like and how that might need to be altered under the future climate. I think that's what it's all about, and I think Alexis' paper did a pretty good job of that. And but it's a starting point. Like that looked at it from a carbon perspective, and I think there is a need to look at it from the other values that we're managing for as well.
And I guess I would throw in there, some of the ideas presented here in terms of treating the forests are probably going to consider it a little bit radical or extreme, but I'm hoping that what we at least put out there for people to consider is that the fuels reduction focus that we currently have is great for dealing with or being directed towards the wildfire problem. But there's this longer term, more substantial problem of how we actually make these forests resistant, not just to wildfire, but this whole host of stressors that are coming at it. And, as both Lex and Rob and Ryan are pointing out, the situation looks like it's going to get worse in the future rather than better. So I would even suggest that what we're suggesting here in terms of treatment levels is probably on the modest end of what's going to be required to make these forests able to deal with what's coming at them down the pike with climate change and with really changed disturbance regimes.
If we're ready to move on, I saw another interesting question that actually kind of relates to that, and it also ties into Rob's slide when he showed that area that had been burned 3 times, but really had very little, structural manipulation. So the question pertains to essentially a previous paper that Malcolm did in 2015, looking at the essentially the opportunity for doing mechanical treatments for restoration, and recognizing that across much of the Sierra, and more so in the Southern Sierra, there's very little opportunity, maybe on the order of 25% of the forested area for which you can actually do mechanical treatments on, and which then the next supposition was that you had to use managed fire in order to restore it. And so I think this question here ties in, is asking essentially, how are we going to get there if we can't use mechanical treatments on a lot of area? And I'll just suggest that we had some findings from actually, again, that Stanislaus Yosemite area, where there were wildfires that burned into the study area. And it turned out that areas that burned at moderate severity, which by the way is a pretty large class, a fairly undefined class, in general, on average, they tended to approximate historical conditions. So if you have essentially fire that is doing some amount of torching, where it's killing some overstory trees, but certainly not killing them all, that actually can get you close to some of those historical densities. So I think we can make a leap saying that if we had a managed fire program for which we had more fire burning out there that had moderate severity effects, and not just the most severe effects, right? Not under the worst conditions, and then also not just under the very mildest conditions for which you get that underburn that we see in this picture. I think that we could be shooting for something, moderate severity fire to be doing some work for us. Now, there's a lot of issues obviously related to that. We don't, it's not something that can be done everywhere, but there is hope, I think, of wildfire doing some of the work for us.
Malcolm, did you have anything to add on the mechanical thinning paper?
A very unpopular paper in certain places, but it was mostly just try to get a bounds on, to what extent could we use thinning as a tool? And I still am a big believer in using mechanical thinning wherever we can. But I think, what Brandon's alluding to is that it's a useful tool, particularly for getting more fire on the landscape. And I do think that if we're going to use it effectively as an anchor, as a security place to really hold the fire, that maybe that opens up the ability to have higher intensity fires out there, or at least moderate effects, because I really think that one of the take homes from both of these studies, both Lex's and our paper, is that you really have to go after density, and you're just not going to make much of a density impact with pretty cautious prescribed burns or very low severity fires. Is that you're really going to have to take out some of the intermediate sized trees, and to do that, we should be pushing hotter fires out there on the landscape when we can safely do it.
Great. I remember when that came out, I was looking for the numbers on the plumas. And one of the things that I would say is, I think when you did that, we were using 35% as tractor ground, which is common on the National Forest System lands. But in private, they're willing to use ground-based mechanical thinning equipment on slopes up to 45% or slightly higher than that with winch. And so I think it does beg for, hey, we need to restore structure as much as possible, because there's a lot of part of our landscape where we don't have that tool. And so we're going to have to accept perhaps more variable or less than desirable effects if we're just using fire. And to me, I think that was the most interesting piece, is this linkage of fire as a process, but also structure. Because simply, trying to burn these stands, and Rob, I think you hit the nail on the head, is if we just think about surface fuels and ladder fuels, we're losing sight of drought resistance, which we know is going to be, from the drought and the creek fire, has the potential for creating a huge fuel problem and much more extreme fire behavior in the future. And so I think I think we all are wholeheartedly into this idea that we need more fire on the landscape, but I think we also need to be thinking about structure and how those two interact. And then, so Rob, I'm gonna tag you with that piece on pyrosilviculture, because we did get some questions about maintenance, and I'm hoping you might be able to give some thoughts on maintenance before in our last 3 minutes.
Yeah, well, that's a huge. To me, this idea of going for lower density really changes the silvicultural prescription landscape. It does. To me, it means we're going to have to focus more on managing the understory as opposed to the overstory. Once we reduce the canopy overstory down to low competition levels, and one of the reasons I use that picture as an example of a pyrosilvicultural system is because of the maintenance treatment that it showed. There was a mastication treatment and then a prescribed fire, and I'm not saying maintenance has to include those two things. It's just what worked. It's what worked to follow up the canopy thinning with a treatment that enables that stand trajectory to maintain a low density overall. And so I think that because if you just focus on canopy thinning, we're talking about intervals, like entry intervals that are like 30 or 40 years in between intervals, and then we kind of get away from the disturbance frequency that that fire used to have. And so yeah, to me it really does refocus the effort that we're going to have in the future on maintenance treatments, whether it's fire or chemicals or mastication. I think that's going to be different depending on the different landowners, and the objectives that they have, but it's hugely important.
We are at 4 o'clock. We're a minute away from 4 o'clock. If any of the panelists have any last thoughts, please speak now or forever hold your peace.
Then I'll add a quick housekeeping thing. As I mentioned, this was recorded, and I'll try to get it up by the end of the week, and I'll email everybody who registered, which you all should have probably registered in order to be on this. So I'll email you that with that. And then somebody mentioned putting some of the papers up that were referenced. So we'll try to do that as well, and other resources. So the learning can continue after this. I know we had a lot of questions we didn't get to, but now you can speak now or forever hold your peace. I have to get my word in there.
Hey, I'd just like to thank everybody for attending. There were 33 awesome questions that we couldn't get to. And I just want to thank Malcolm and Brandon and Lex and Rob and Stacy for their carving out the time to do this today. I really appreciate it. It's pretty cool to get everybody on one webinar. So.
Well, thanks so much, Stacy and Ryan, for getting this organized. I appreciate being here.
Yeah, thank you both.